The box incident was about as close as it came, yeah.
They were not feared at first. They were welcomed. They smiled easily. They listened carefully. They knew how to mirror desire, trust, and vulnerability. Some looked intelligent. Some looked harmless. Some looked unforgettable. They were invited into homes, cars, friendships, and lives, not because they forced their way in, but because they were allowed. This is not a story about monsters hiding in shadows. It is a story about men who blended in, men whose charm became a disguise, and how, time after time, it proved far more dangerous than violence alone. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy slow, deeply researched true crime documentaries. Now, let's begin. Los Angeles County, California, August 1969. By the final weeks of the summer of 1969, Charles Manson no longer needed to persuade anyone to listen. They were already listening. Manson did not command attention through force or intimidation. He did not dominate rooms with volume or threats. His presence was quieter than that. He listened longer than most people were comfortable with. He repeated phrases back slowly, reshaping them just enough to feel meaningful. He made individuals feel understood in a world that had taught them they were invisible. That ability became his power. Los Angeles County in the late 1960s was filled with movement. Young people arrived from across the country carrying disappointment, anger, and hope in equal measure. The promises of peace and social change had begun to fracture. Authority felt dishonest. Tradition felt suffocating. Many were searching not for answers, but for somewhere to belong. Manson offered exactly that. At Spawn Ranch, an abandoned movie set tucked into the hills, he created an isolated world where time blurred and identity dissolved. Days followed no structure. Names were replaced with roles. Personal histories were reframed as wounds inflicted by society itself. Manson positioned himself not as a leader, but as a guide who simply reflected truth back to those around him. Freedom, he told them, meant surrender. Love, he said, meant obedience. Understanding, he implied, could only be reached by letting go of the self. What made Manson's charm so dangerous was its flexibility. He adjusted himself to whoever stood in front of him. To some, he was a spiritual teacher. To others, a misunderstood musician betrayed by the industry. To many, he was a prophet decoding hidden messages buried in popular music and culture. He rarely argued. He absorbed. Over time, his language shifted. Conversations about society became darker. He spoke of an inevitable collapse, a violent reckoning he referred to as helter-skelter. He did not define it clearly. Instead, he allowed his followers to interpret it, discuss it, and slowly internalize it as truth. Ambiguity was essential. By never stating his intentions outright, Manson encouraged devotion to grow organically. Followers competed for insight, for approval, for closeness. The more extreme their beliefs became, the more validated they felt. Violence entered the conversation not as an act, but as a concept. First symbolic, then necessary, then inevitable. By early August 1969, Manson decided the moment for suggestion had passed. He did not go himself. Instead, he selected followers who had demonstrated unquestioning loyalty. He framed their task not as murder, but as purpose, a signal meant to awaken the world, an action designed to accelerate the chaos he believed was coming. On the night of August 8th, members of the group entered a home on Cielo Drive. The victims were chosen not for personal reasons, but for what the act would represent. The violence was extreme. The message was deliberate. Words were written in blood, echoing the ideology Manson had spent months cultivating. The following night, more killings followed at a different location. Throughout it all, Manson remained physically distant but psychologically present. His influence shaped every decision. His worldview justified every act. He had succeeded in removing himself from direct violence while remaining its source. When investigators began piecing together what had happened, the public searched for explanations that felt safe. Brainwashing, hypnosis, insanity, anything that separated ordinary people from what had occurred. But the truth was less comforting. Manson did not remove free will. He slowly eroded responsibility. He reframed cruelty as necessity and doubt as weakness. He taught his followers that morality was an illusion created to control them. Over time, empathy became something to be discarded. Even after his arrest, the charm did not disappear. In court, Manson smirked and stared directly at cameras. He interrupted proceedings. He carved symbols into his skin. He transformed the trial into performance, fully aware of the attention he commanded. Letters poured in from admirers. Some insisted he had been misunderstood. Others believed he possessed insight society refused to accept. That lingering fascination revealed the most disturbing element of his legacy. Charm does not disappear when truth is revealed. It simply finds new ways to survive. Charles Manson never held the knife during those nights. He did not need to. His influence had already completed the work. The murders were not a deviation from his philosophy. They were its outcome. When the courtroom doors finally closed, Manson was sentenced to spend the rest of his life confined. Yet the question he left behind remained unanswered. How many people are willing to surrender judgment simply because certainty feels comforting? As the 1960s faded into memory, the world told itself it had learned something from Charles Manson. It had not. It had only learned how easily charm could be mistaken for truth. Bangkok, Thailand, early 1971. Where Charles Manson shaped belief, Charles Sobhraj shaped trust. He did not preach to crowds or surround himself with followers. He did not need ideology. He needed proximity. One conversation, one shared meal, one quiet reassurance offered at exactly the right moment. In the early 1970s, Southeast Asia had become a magnet for Western travelers. Young men and women drifted along overland routes through India, Nepal, Thailand, and beyond. They were searching for experience, meaning, escape. Many traveled slowly, unburdened by schedules, and convinced that openness was a form of wisdom. Charles Sobhraj understood that mindset instinctively. He was articulate, composed, and well-dressed. He spoke several languages and moved through international spaces with ease. To travelers far from home, he appeared sophisticated and generous, someone experienced, someone who understood how borders, visas, and local customs worked, someone who could be trusted. In Bangkok, Sobhraj and his companions deliberately embedded themselves within expatriate and backpacker communities. They hosted dinners, offered places to stay, assisted with travel documents and border crossings. When someone encountered trouble, Sobhraj was quick to step forward with calm solutions. He never rushed the process. Trust was cultivated gradually through shared meals, long conversations, and small acts of kindness that felt organic rather than calculated. He listened closely, remembered personal details, mirrored anxieties. He made people feel protected in an unfamiliar world. By the time suspicion might have formed, reliance had already taken hold. Charm was not an accessory to his crimes. It was the method itself. Once someone entered his inner circle, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Victims were drugged under the pretense of illness, celebration, or relaxation. When confusion followed, Sobhraj framed it as temporary, something he could manage. He positioned himself as caretaker and authority at the same time. Passports disappeared, money vanished. Mobility ended. For some, captivity lasted days or weeks. During that time, Sobhraj tightened control, isolating victims from any external help, while maintaining the appearance of concern. For others, captivity ended in death. What distinguished Sobhraj from many killers was patience. He did not act impulsively or emotionally. Murders were deliberate and calculated. Poisonings were staged as food poisoning. Drownings were framed as accidents. Burned bodies erased identities entirely, making identification difficult or impossible. Each death bought him time. International travel worked decisively in his favor. Victims were often reported missing weeks or months later. Families were thousands of miles away. Jurisdictional confusion slowed investigations. Police forces struggled to communicate across borders. By the time patterns began to emerge, Sobhraj had already moved on. Even when suspicion intensified, his demeanor remained unchanged. He spoke calmly to police, cooperatively. He framed himself as helpful, even concerned. He offered selective information, guiding conversations without appearing evasive. To investigators unfamiliar with his full history, he appeared more like a witness than a suspect. Those who encountered him frequently described the same impression. He seemed intelligent, engaging, slightly mysterious, but never threatening. He did not resemble the danger they imagined. That illusion allowed him to continue operating. When Sobhraj was eventually arrested, his behavior revealed the depth of his manipulation. He treated imprisonment not as punishment, but as an inconvenience. He charmed guards, exploited legal loopholes. At one point, he deliberately committed crimes to extend his sentence, timing his incarceration to avoid extradition to countries where he faced murder charges. It was strategy, not impulse. Unlike Manson, Sobhraj did not seek followers or believers. He sought leverage. His victims were not converted. They were selected carefully, isolated methodically, controlled completely. Yet the mechanism remained the same. Charm as access, charm as camouflage, charm as control. Sobhraj understood that people far from home crave reassurance more than certainty. He provided it convincingly. He did not force trust. He invited it, nurtured it, and weaponized it. Years later, as books and dramatizations revisited his story, fascination persisted. Interviews emphasized his intelligence, his composure, his refusal to show remorse. To some observers, those qualities were mistaken for depth or complexity. In truth, they were tools. Charles Sobhraj did not believe in destiny, prophecy, or ideology. He believed in opportunity, in patience, in the quiet advantage of being underestimated. He demonstrated how kindness could be used as a weapon and how openness could become vulnerability. By the time authorities fully connected the trail of disappearances, dozens of lives had already been lost across multiple countries. The lesson was unmistakable. The most dangerous predators do not announce themselves. They introduce themselves politely, they offer help, and they wait. As the 1970s continued, travel became easier, borders more porous, and trust more casually given. In that expanding world, charm did not fade as a weapon. It adapted, and thousands of miles away, in the quiet neighborhoods of the American Midwest, another man was learning that respectability could be just as effective a disguise as friendliness. Chicago, Illinois, January 1972. Charles Sobhraj proved that charm could move freely across borders. John Wayne Gacy would prove that it did not need to travel at all. It could live next door. In the early 1970s, Gacy was the kind of man communities trusted instinctively. He was sociable, energetic, and deeply involved in local life. He volunteered. He attended political events. He shook hands easily and remembered names. To neighbors and colleagues, he appeared ambitious and dependable. He looked like success. Gacy lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Chicago, a place defined by routine and familiarity. Lawns were trimmed, doors were unlocked. People assumed safety was built into the environment itself. Gacy understood that assumption, and he leaned into it completely. His charm was loud, not subtle. He laughed often, he told stories, he made himself useful. When people spoke about their problems, he listened with exaggerated concern. When opportunities arose to help, he volunteered first. He cultivated the image of a man who belonged everywhere. Behind that image, something darker was already forming. Gacy ran a contracting business and regularly hired young men and teenage boys, many of them vulnerable or in need of money. He positioned himself as a mentor, a benefactor, someone willing to give chances others would not. To employees and acquaintances, he was generous, even fatherly. That generosity came with expectations. Inside his home, the tone shifted. What began as jokes or boundary testing escalated into control. Gacy framed abuse as misunderstanding, as humor, as something the victim had misinterpreted. When resistance appeared, he laughed it off. When fear surfaced, he dismissed it. Like others before him, Gacy did not rely on brute force alone. He relied on disbelief. He famously demonstrated handcuff tricks, presenting them as harmless illusions. He invited victims to participate. Once restrained, escape became nearly impossible. What followed was violence carried out behind closed doors, beneath a mask of normalcy maintained in public. Over time, the murders accumulated. Gacy killed inside his own home, burying victims beneath the crawl space. The house became both crime scene and hiding place. The smell was explained away. The signs were ignored. People trusted the image more than their instincts. That trust was essential. Neighbors described him as friendly. Police saw him as cooperative. He spoke confidently during interviews, offering just enough information to appear transparent. When questioned, he leaned into his civic involvement. His community standing insulated him from scrutiny. Charm, in Gacy's case, was reinforced by respectability. He dressed well, he networked, he presented himself as a pillar of the neighborhood. He even performed as a clown at community events. Adopting a persona meant to entertain children and families. The image was absurdly incongruent with the reality beneath it. Yet it worked. Victims disappeared, but no immediate pattern was recognized. Many were young men whose absences did not prompt immediate investigations. Some were assumed to have run away. Others were overlooked entirely. Gacy understood which lives would not be urgently searched for. As law enforcement slowly began to connect missing persons to Gacy's home, his demeanor remained calm. He cooperated, he joked, he acted inconvenienced rather than threatened. Even when evidence mounted, he continued to project confidence. When the truth finally emerged, it was overwhelming. Bodies were recovered from beneath the house. The scale of the violence shocked the nation. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the man they knew with what had been uncovered. Interviews captured disbelief, repeated again and again. He was so nice. He seemed normal. We never suspected. That disbelief was part of the damage. Gacy's charm had not only enabled his crimes, it had delayed justice. It had silenced suspicion. It had allowed violence to continue in plain sight, protected by familiarity and routine. In court, the image finally collapsed. The friendly contractor became a convicted murderer. The community figure became a symbol of betrayal. Yet, even then, fascination lingered. Media coverage fixated on the contradiction, on how someone so outwardly ordinary could harbor such brutality. The answer was simpler than many wanted to accept. Charm does not require goodness. It requires consistency. Gacy was consistent in his presentation. He understood how to perform normalcy convincingly. He understood how authority, friendliness, and status could deflect attention. He exploited social expectations that discouraged confrontation and rewarded politeness. Unlike Sobhraj, Gacy did not prey on strangers passing through. He preyed on those close enough to trust him, those who believed familiarity equaled safety. His crimes forced a painful realization. Danger does not always arrive from the outside. Sometimes it is invited in. As investigators closed the case and the house on his street became infamous, the neighborhood's sense of security was permanently altered. The illusion that evil announces itself had been shattered. And as the 1970s moved forward, the pattern became clearer. Charm could cross borders. Charm could wear respectability. Charm could hide in plain sight. Somewhere else in America, another man was learning to combine intelligence, attractiveness, and empathy into a more portable disguise, one that would allow him to move easily between campuses, cities, and victims. And unlike Gacy, he would not stay in one place long enough for familiarity to betray him. Washington State, January 1974. John Wayne Gacy proved that charm could hide behind familiarity. Ted Bundy proved it could move. By the early 1970s, Bundy moved through the world with an ease that disarmed almost everyone he encountered. He was intelligent, articulate, and outwardly composed. He dressed neatly, spoke thoughtfully, and understood how to present himself as someone worth trusting. More importantly, he understood how to make others feel chosen. Bundy did not look dangerous. That was the foundation of everything. He presented himself as earnest and slightly vulnerable, a law student, a volunteer, a young man invested in politics, justice, and social causes. He spoke with confidence, but rarely arrogance. He listened carefully. He mirrored opinions. He created the impression of shared values. People saw what they expected to see. Bundy understood the power of appearing ordinary. He understood that danger, in the public imagination, was loud, disheveled, and obvious. He made sure he was none of those things. In Washington State, his approach was deliberate. He targeted public places where trust was assumed rather than questioned. College campuses, libraries, busy walkways, areas where politeness governed interaction. He often pretended to be injured, wearing a sling or using crutches, asking for help with small tasks, carrying books, loading a car, opening a door. The requests were harmless. The tone was polite. Saying no felt unnecessary. His charm lay in restraint. He never rushed conversations. He did not pressure or intimidate. He allowed others to feel helpful and in control. By the time doubt might have surfaced, proximity had already been established. Once, victims were close enough. The shift was immediate. What followed happened away from witnesses, hidden behind trees, remote locations, and locked doors. Bundy relied on isolation as much as deception. He moved bodies, returned to crime scenes, manipulated evidence. His actions were methodical, calculated, and increasingly confident. Unlike Gacy, Bundy did not rely on a fixed location. He understood that familiarity bred attention. Mobility created anonymity. He crossed state lines, changed routines, adapted his methods. Each crime refined the next. His intelligence extended beyond the acts themselves. Bundy studied investigation techniques. He followed media coverage. He paid attention to police behavior. When questioned early on, he cooperated fully. He provided information willingly. He appeared invested in helping the investigation rather than evading it. Witnesses described him as calm, polite, almost helpful. That perception mattered. Even as his name surfaced among suspects, people hesitated. Friends defended him. Partners trusted him. Colleagues dismissed concerns. He did not fit the profile they had been taught to fear. He seemed too normal. Bundy also understood the protective value of emotional connection. He maintained friendships, romantic relationships, social circles. These connections created buffers against suspicion. Each relationship became evidence of normalcy. When accusations arose, disbelief followed. As his crimes escalated, so did his confidence. He began to believe in his own invulnerability. Each successful evasion reinforced the idea that his intelligence and charm placed him above consequence. That arrogance eventually became visible. When Bundy was arrested, the performance shifted rather than ended. In court, he represented himself. He argued motions. He cross-examined witnesses. He spoke eloquently, making eye contact with jurors. He married while on trial. He transformed the courtroom into another stage for control. Media's coverage fixated on his appearance. Headlines emphasized his intelligence and attractiveness. The narrative itself became distorted, framing him as an anomaly rather than a reflection of social blind spots. Even his confessions, delivered late and selectively, were calculated. He spoke in the third person. He intellectualized violence. He withheld details until the final moments, trading information for attention and delay. Bundy's charm was not warmth, it was precision. He understood what people wanted to believe and reflected it back flawlessly. He weaponized empathy. He exploited politeness. He relied on the assumption that danger announces itself clearly. Unlike Manson, Bundy did not need ideology. Unlike Sobhraj, he did not need dependency. Unlike Gacy, he did not need a single place. He needed belief. Belief that education equaled morality. Belief that intelligence prevented brutality. Belief that someone articulate could not be violent. By the time those beliefs collapsed, the damage was irreversible. Bundy's case forced a reckoning. Intelligence does not prevent cruelty. Attractiveness does not guarantee safety. Confidence does not indicate integrity. Charm can be engineered. And engineering can be lethal. When his execution finally ended the case, fascination did not disappear. Books, documentaries, and dramatizations revisited his story again and again. Often they lingered on how he looked rather than what he did. That fixation was not harmless. Ted Bundy demonstrated that predators do not need to hide in shadows. They can stand in plain sight, speaking softly, asking politely, and allowing trust to do the work for them. As the nation absorbed the implications of his crimes, one truth became unavoidable. If charm could move freely across states and intelligence could disguise violence, then the threat was not isolated. It was embedded. And while Bundy relied on movement and performance, another man was beginning his own series of killings in a far more confined setting, one defined by isolation, routine, and control behind closed doors. The charm would be quieter this time, more domestic, and far easier to overlook. London, England, December 1978. Ted Bundy showed how charm could move freely through public spaces. Dennis Nilsen proved it did not need to move at all. It could wait. By the late 1970s, Dennis Nilsen lived a life so ordinary it barely registered. He worked predictable hours, paid his rent on time, and returned each evening to a modest residence in North London. He did not draw attention to himself. He did not seek admiration, authority, or influence. His charm was quieter than the men before him, and because of that, it was easier to miss. Nilsen appeared polite, reserved, and socially awkward. Neighbors described him as shy. Co-workers saw him as withdrawn but reliable. There were no obvious warning signs, no volatility, no outward instability. He blended into the background of the city effortlessly. That invisibility became his protection. Nilsen targeted men who existed on the margins. Many were homeless, some were drifters. Others were simply isolated, detached from family or support networks. He encountered them in pubs, on the streets, or through chance conversations. He offered what they needed most: warmth, food, alcohol, a place to sleep. Unlike others, Nilsen did not rush intimacy. He did not pressure or persuade aggressively. He invited conversation, shared drinks, listened carefully. He mirrored loneliness back to those he met, presenting himself as someone who understood what it meant to be unseen. For men accustomed to being ignored, that attention mattered. Once inside his home, the atmosphere shifted slowly. Alcohol flowed freely. Fatigue set in. Defenses lowered. Nilsen waited patiently. He did not act in moments of chaos or confrontation. He waited until his victims were asleep or unconscious. Violence followed quietly: strangulation, drowning, methods that required proximity, patience, and control. Unlike many killers, Nilsen did not seek escape or distance after death. He stayed. He washed the bodies, dressed them, sat with them, spoke to them. He treated the remains as companions rather than evidence. Control did not end with death. It intensified. For days or weeks, the bodies remained inside his home. He shared meals with them, watched television beside them. This was not concealment in the traditional sense. It was preservation, an attempt to maintain connection long after life had ended. Eventually, reality intervened. Disposal became necessary, and Nilsen approached it with the same methodical calm. Bodies were dismembered carefully. Remains were burned in fires or flushed away in small portions. No single act drew attention. No single disappearance prompted urgency. The victims were men society rarely searched for. That absence of scrutiny was essential. Even when plumbing problems arose, caused by human remains clogging pipes, suspicion did not immediately fall on him. He cooperated with authorities, spoke calmly, explained situations without visible panic. There was no outward guilt to provoke deeper investigation. His demeanor was disarming in its normalcy. When police finally uncovered the truth, the revelation was deeply unsettling. Not because Nilsen resisted, but because he did not. He did not flee. He did not deny what he had done. He spoke openly, even casually, describing his crimes with disturbing clarity. There was no attempt to justify himself morally, no attempt to perform remorse. Instead, he framed his actions as responses to loneliness, as solutions to isolation, as if companionship, even through death, had been preferable to being alone. That honesty disturbed investigators more than denial might have. In court, Nilsen did not attempt to charm jurors or the public. He did not seek sympathy or attention. His emotional flatness became its own source of unease. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and removed quietly from society. Yet, his case lingered in a different way. Dennis Nilsen forced a confrontation with a less dramatic form of danger. Not the predator who hunts aggressively, not the manipulator who dazzles with charisma, but the man who waits patiently for someone to need him. His charm was absence of urgency, absence of threat, absence of spectacle. He demonstrated that violence does not always announce itself through dominance or performance. Sometimes it arrives through routine, silence, and the promise of shelter, through the simple offer of not being alone. As the 1980s approached, cities grew larger and more anonymous. People became easier to lose. Lives slipped between systems unnoticed. In that environment, Nilsen thrived quietly for years. But the era of subtlety was coming to an end. Another killer was emerging, whose crimes would be louder, more grotesque, and impossible to ignore. One whose charm would hide behind politeness and domestic normalcy so convincingly that even law enforcement would stand inside the danger and fail to see it. The waiting would give way to escalation, and the silence would soon be broken. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, June 1978. Dennis Nilsen showed how violence could exist quietly, hidden behind routine and isolation. Jeffrey Dahmer would show how it could persist even when seen, questioned, and narrowly escaped. Because unlike the men before him, Dahmer was noticed, again and again. In the summer of 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. It did not immediately set off alarms. It did not begin a visible pattern. It existed at first as an isolated act, buried beneath circumstance, family upheaval, and a young man already drifting toward invisibility. Dahmer appeared awkward rather than threatening. He was shy, withdrawn, and socially uncomfortable. Classmates remembered him as strange, quiet, sometimes unsettling, but never dangerous. He did not project confidence or authority. He projected discomfort. That discomfort became his camouflage. As an adult, Dahmer lived alone in modest apartments across Ohio and Wisconsin. He worked low-level jobs. He drank heavily. He kept to himself. Neighbors described him as odd but polite, someone you noticed briefly, then forgot. That forgettability mattered. Dahmer targeted men who were vulnerable, isolated, or marginalized. Many were young. Many were gay men navigating a society that offered limited protection and even less urgency when they disappeared. He met them in bars, on the street, or through casual encounters. He offered companionship, alcohol, and a place to go. He did not rush trust. Dahmer spoke softly, listened attentively. He presented himself as lonely rather than predatory. For those who accepted his invitation, the encounter felt consensual at first, safe enough, ordinary enough. Once inside his apartment, the dynamic shifted. Alcohol flowed. Drugs were introduced, consciousness faded. What followed was violence carried out in private spaces where screams could not be heard and resistance was chemically removed. Dahmer's methods were calculated, repetitive, and increasingly ritualized. Unlike Bundy, Dahmer did not seek movement. Unlike Gacy, he did not rely on community status. Unlike Sobhraj, he did not build dependency over time. He relied on opportunity and neglect. After death, control continued. Dahmer dismembered bodies, preserved remains, kept skulls, photographed victims. He attempted crude experiments meant to create compliance without resistance, seeking permanent control rather than temporary domination. These acts escalated gradually, each boundary crossed making the next easier. What makes Dahmer's case uniquely disturbing is how often intervention almost happened. Neighbors complained about smells, police were called. Victims escaped, only to be returned to him. Authorities stood inside his apartment, surrounded by warning signs, and failed to recognize what they were seeing. His demeanor disarmed suspicion. Dahmer spoke calmly, explained situations without agitation. He appeared embarrassed rather than dangerous. Officers accepted his explanations. Assumptions filled the gaps where investigation should have existed. The system failed repeatedly. Those failures allowed the killings to continue for years. When Dahmer was finally arrested in 1991, the discovery shocked even seasoned investigators. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, remains, proof that violence had occurred not once, but many times, in full view of a society that had looked away. Unlike others, Dahmer did not perform remorse theatrically. He confessed openly, spoke plainly. He acknowledged his actions without attempting to justify them. His affect was flat, detached. He appeared more resigned than defiant. That honesty unsettled the public. Media coverage struggled to frame him. He did not fit the mold of the charismatic manipulator or the domineering predator. He was awkward, soft-spoken, emotionally vacant. The contradiction confused expectations. Yet charm was still present, not as charisma, but as non-threat. Dahmer benefited from assumptions that awkwardness equaled harmlessness, that discomfort meant vulnerability rather than danger, that someone who seemed socially inept could not be calculating or violent. Those assumptions proved deadly. His case exposed a different failure than the ones before, not the power of persuasion or status, but the consequences of dismissal, the cost of not taking discomfort seriously. The danger of assuming violence announces itself clearly. Jeffrey Dahmer did not hide behind confidence. He hid behind dismissal. After his conviction, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Years later, he would die at the hands of another inmate. For many, that ending felt like closure. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions about accountability, prevention, and responsibility. Dahmer's story forced a reckoning. How many times can warning signs be ignored before silence becomes complicity? As the 1980s faded into the 1990s, the world became more connected. Media coverage intensified, public awareness grew, and yet the pattern did not end. Another killer was about to emerge whose crimes would be louder, faster, and fueled by terror rather than concealment. One who would not rely on invisibility or silence. The charm would return again. But this time, it would walk openly through unlocked doors, leaving fear behind instead of quiet. California. April 1984. Jeffrey Dahmer showed how violence could persist through neglect and dismissal. Richard Ramirez would destroy that illusion completely. He did not want to be overlooked. He wanted to be feared. By the spring of 1984, California began to experience a different kind of terror. This was not careful manipulation or quiet isolation. This was intrusion, randomness, the sudden realization that danger could arrive without warning, without logic, and without familiarity. Richard Ramirez did not charm his way into people's lives. He broke in. Yet even here, charm still played a role. It simply appeared in fragments, moments where he passed unnoticed, underestimated, or dismissed before the violence began. Ramirez moved through Los Angeles and surrounding areas like a ghost. He was transient, sleeping wherever he could, drifting between neighborhoods without patterns that were easy to track. His appearance was unsettling. His teeth were decayed, his clothes dirty, his gaze intense. He looked out of place. And still, people interacted with him. They asked if he needed help. They allowed him near their homes. They let him pass through public spaces without alarm. That hesitation mattered. Ramirez targeted homes at night, entering through unlocked doors or windows. He did not care who lived inside. Age did not matter. Gender did not matter. Wealth did not matter. Opportunity was the only requirement. Once inside, violence was immediate and extreme. He used whatever weapons were available: guns, knives, blunt objects. He assaulted, tortured, and killed with brutality that felt chaotic and unpredictable. Survivors described sudden explosions of violence, often preceded by silence. Unlike Bundy or Gacy, Ramirez did not rely on extended interaction. There was no slow grooming process, no illusion of mentorship or safety. The attack itself was the introduction. Yet his ability to continue depended on something familiar: dismissal. In public, Ramirez knew how to shrink. He avoided confrontation. He lowered his voice. He changed his posture. He understood when to appear harmless enough to move on unnoticed. He rode buses, sat in diners, walked through neighborhoods during the day. People noticed him. They just did not act. As the attacks mounted, fear spread rapidly across California. Media coverage intensified. Police task forces expanded. Sketches were released. Residents armed themselves. Doors were locked. Neighborhood watches formed. The randomness created panic. Anyone could be next. Anywhere could be targeted. Ramirez became known as the Night Stalker, a name that transformed him from a man into a symbol. That symbol spread faster than facts. Witness descriptions varied. Sketches conflicted. His appearance changed. He cut his hair, changed clothing, adjusted behavior. He blended chaos with adaptability. While law enforcement struggled to identify him, Ramirez escalated. The violence became more brazen, the cruelty more pronounced. He left behind symbols. He spoke openly about his beliefs. He wanted his presence to be known. Fear was not collateral damage. It was the objective. Yet even during this period of intense visibility, moments of underestimation continued. People encountered him during the day and did not connect the face to the threat. He slipped through spaces where suspicion should have stopped him. The public image of danger still lagged behind reality. When Ramirez was finally identified, it was not through flawless investigation alone. It was through recognition. A face remembered. A moment where fear turned into certainty. Civilians spotted him, chased him, and physically restrained him until police arrived. The shift was sudden. The man who had inspired statewide terror was beaten and held by the very public he had hunted. Fear turned into fury. The illusion of untouchability collapsed. In court, Ramirez did not retreat into silence or remorse. He performed. He smirked, glared, made gestures meant to provoke and shock. He spoke openly about allegiance to darkness, rejecting sympathy and responsibility alike. That defiance captivated attention. Letters poured in. Admirers wrote. Some expressed fascination. Others romanticized his rebellion. Even at his most openly violent, interest clung to him. Media. Coverage lingered on his presence, his expressions, his posture. Charm did not disappear. It transformed, not into likability, but notoriety. Ramirez demonstrated that spectacle itself could become a form of attraction. That fear could magnetize attention just as effectively as politeness. That being monstrous did not exclude being followed. His crimes forced a reckoning with a different reality. Danger does not always hide behind normalcy. Sometimes it announces itself loudly and still moves freely. When Ramirez was sentenced, relief swept through California. But the psychological damage remained. Doors stayed locked, trust eroded. The randomness had permanently altered how safety was understood. People no longer asked who might be dangerous. They asked where. Richard Ramirez showed that charm does not always mean comfort or persuasion. Sometimes it exists in the ability to pass unnoticed until the moment violence erupts. Sometimes it is the false confidence that danger will look different. As the 1980s drew to a close, the public believed it had witnessed every possible face of violence: manipulation, respectability, intelligence, neglect, chaos. It had not. Because in the decade that followed, another killer would emerge, whose crimes would be driven not by terror or compulsion, but by obsession and entitlement. One who moved through elite circles, intimate relationships, and places of privilege, convinced the world owed him something. The charm would narrow again, become personal, and once more, prove deadly. United States, April 1997. Richard Ramirez showed how terror could announce itself loudly and still move freely. Andrew Cunanan would prove that charm could return to something far quieter, personal, intimate, convincing. By the spring of 1997, Cunanan did not look like a man about to become the center of a national manhunt. He was articulate, well-dressed, and socially fluent. He moved easily through conversations, adapting himself to whoever stood in front of him. He knew how to be impressive without appearing arrogant, interesting without seeming threatening. People enjoyed his company. Cunanan had spent years practicing this. From a young age, he learned how stories could be reshaped to fit the listener. He exaggerated achievements, invented connections, adjusted his background depending on the room. The lies were not sloppy, they were tailored. That adaptability became his identity. He gravitated toward wealthy, influential men, offering admiration, wit, and companionship in exchange for access and support. He presented himself as cultured and intelligent, someone who belonged in exclusive spaces. Many believed him. Some overlooked inconsistencies. Others simply did not ask. Charm filled the gaps. By 1997, Cunanan's life was unraveling. Financial support disappeared. Relationships collapsed. The carefully constructed image began to crack. What remained was entitlement paired with desperation. The violence that followed was sudden and mobile. Cunanan's killings did not follow a single pattern. Each victim was selected from his personal orbit, connected through history, rejection, or perceived betrayal. The murders unfolded across multiple states, turning his actions into a spree rather than a series. He did not hide afterward. Instead, Cunanan moved openly. He used aliases, changed appearances, traveled freely. He stayed with acquaintances, slept in familiar spaces. He relied on the same charm that had sustained him socially to keep him invisible as a suspect. It worked longer than it should have. When his name finally became public, the shock was immediate. Friends struggled to reconcile the image they knew with the violence described. Interviews repeated the same disbelief. He was so intelligent, so engaging, so normal. Cunanan did not fit the public image of a killer on the run. He did not look panicked or disorganized. Surveillance. Footage showed him calm, controlled, almost relaxed. He did not appear to be fleeing. He appeared to be continuing. The most infamous moment came in Miami Beach, where Cunanan murdered a globally recognized fashion figure in broad daylight. The act transformed the case instantly. What had been a regional pursuit became international news. The scale of attention exploded, and still, Cunanan remained elusive. He hid in plain sight, blending into environments where attention was expected: hotels, tourist areas, public streets. His confidence did not waver. He did not behave like someone hunted. That composure unsettled investigators. Unlike Bundy or Ramirez, Cunanan did not seek control through fear or dominance. He sought recognition, validation, a sense of significance restored through destruction. Each act felt less about secrecy and more about narrative. He wanted the story to be noticed. Yet beneath that visibility, charm continued to operate quietly. People spoke to him, helped him, did not immediately see threat. The same social fluency that once opened doors now delayed capture. When the spree ended, it did so abruptly. Cunanan took his own life before arrest. There would be no trial, no public testimony, no detailed confessions. Only fragments. The absence of answers left the public searching for explanations. Motive was debated endlessly, psychology dissected, theories multiplied, but certainty never arrived. What remained was the pattern. Cunanan did not overpower his victims through strength. He entered their lives through familiarity, through shared history, through trust already established. The violence was personal because the access was personal. Charm was not incidental. It was the bridge. Andrew Cunanan demonstrated that the most dangerous transformations do not always occur in isolation. Sometimes they unfold in social spaces, hidden behind laughter, intelligence, and connection. Sometimes collapse looks composed until the final moment. As the 1990s drew to a close, the public told itself that such sprees were anomalies, products of instability rather than warning signs. That belief would not hold, because the next generation of killers would emerge in a world saturated with visibility, where attention was currency, where notoriety could be cultivated deliberately, and charm, once again, would adapt to the age it inhabited. California, June 1977. Andrew Cunanan showed how charm could collapse into violence when identity unraveled. Rodney Alcala revealed something far colder: charm as performance, charm as bait, charm as documentation. By the late 1970s, Rodney Alcala moved through California with a confidence that felt earned rather than forced. He was tall, physically fit, articulate, and composed. He dressed neatly, spoke clearly, and carried himself like someone accustomed to being listened to. There was nothing erratic about him, nothing visibly unstable. That appearance was deliberate. Alcala understood how credibility worked. He positioned himself as an artist, a photographer, a creative professional. He spoke the language of projects and portfolios. He approached women and girls openly, often in daylight, often in public places, beaches, parks, streets, college areas. He did not hide. He asked politely to take photographs. He explained concepts. He framed encounters as collaborations rather than requests. Compliments were measured, boundaries appeared respected. The interaction felt structured, safe, and ordinary. Many agreed. Photography became his most effective tool. It offered legitimacy and context, a reason to engage without suspicion, a framework in which trust felt reasonable. Alcala did not rush. He allowed conversations to unfold naturally. He asked questions. He listened. He created the sense that nothing dangerous was happening. Charm was the invitation. The camera was the excuse. Behind that facade, violence was already present. Alcala's crimes stretched across years and multiple states. Victims disappeared after encounters that, on the surface, seemed benign. A walk to a quieter location for better lighting. A short drive to a more scenic spot. An invitation framed as artistic necessity rather than isolation. Once separated from public view, the dynamic changed completely. Unlike many killers, Alcala did not seek quick outcomes. He prolonged encounters. He exerted control slowly and deliberately. Victims were restrained, assaulted, and terrorized over extended periods. Violence was not impulsive. It was methodical, repetitive, and deeply sadistic. Control was not incidental. It was the objective. What makes Alcala's case uniquely disturbing is how visible he was while killing. He did not exist on the fringes. He appeared on television. He competed on a popular dating show, presenting himself as charming, intelligent, and desirable. The audience laughed, applauded. The host praised his wit. At the same time, women were disappearing. That contradiction exposed a fundamental vulnerability in perception. Alcala did not resemble danger as society imagined it. He was educated, creative, confident. He navigated social spaces with ease. He fit perfectly into environments built on openness and trust. Even when he was arrested previously for violent offenses, the system failed to stop him. Parole was granted. Warnings were missed or minimized. Each release reinforced his sense of superiority. Each failure strengthened his belief that he could continue without consequence. His charm did not simply delay suspicion, it neutralized it. Alcala's collection of photographs later became one of the most chilling artifacts associated with any serial killer. Hundreds, possibly thousands of images depicting women, teenage girls, and children. Many were smiling, relaxed, unaware. Others appeared uneasy, some fearful. Some were later identified as murder victims. The camera had preserved moments of trust, moments before disappearance, moments where danger looked like opportunity. Each photograph represented a question left unanswered. How many believed him? How many felt safe because the setting felt safe? How many assumed daylight and professionalism were protection? Law enforcement struggled to determine the full scope of his crimes. The confirmed victims were only a fraction of the faces captured on film. The rest remained unknown. The uncertainty became part of the horror. Alcala's charm was not warmth or empathy. It was authority. He spoke like someone used to compliance. He moved like someone accustomed to access. He did not ask permission so much as assume it. His confidence created momentum. People followed without realizing they were being led. When Alcala was finally convicted and sentenced, the revelations continued. Details of prolonged torture, patterns of repeated violence, evidence that suggested far more victims than those officially counted. The scale of what had gone unnoticed forced uncomfortable questions. How many times had he been seen? How many times had he been trusted? How many times had warning signs been reframed as misunderstandings? Rodney Alcala dismantled the idea that danger hides in secrecy. His violence operated in daylight, in public, through professions associated with creativity and trust. He demonstrated that visibility does not prevent predation. It can enable it. Charm, in his case, was not about likability. It was about legitimacy. As the 1970s drew to a close, Alcala's crimes blended into a broader realization. Violence did not require chaos or desperation. It could be organized, patient, embedded within careers, credentials, and social permission. The public began to believe it was learning. Profiles were discussed, warning signs listed, patterns explained. There was confidence that future threats would be easier to recognize. That confidence would not last. Because as the decades progressed, a new type of killer would emerge, one whose appeal would not rely on intelligence, artistry, or respectability. It would rely on attention itself. The mask would no longer be subtle. The audience would be part of the performance, and charm would evolve once again, shaped by a world increasingly hungry for notoriety. Cape Coral, Florida, October 2019. Rodney Alcala showed how charm could hide behind legitimacy and public visibility. Wade Wilson revealed what happens when charm is filtered through notoriety. By the late 2010s, the world had changed. Attention was no longer scarce. It was currency. Visibility could be manufactured. Infamy could be cultivated. And identity itself could be performed for an audience that never looked away. Wade Wilson understood this instinctively. He did not present himself as refined, educated, or respectable. He presented himself as intense, volatile, dangerous in a way that felt performative rather than hidden. Tattoos covered his body. His stare was direct. His presence unsettled people, and yet people were drawn to him. Wilson moved through Florida carrying a reputation that preceded him, a troubled past, a criminal record, stories that followed him from person to person. He did not try to soften those stories, he amplified them. He leaned into the image of unpredictability, allowing fear and fascination to blur together. Charm, in his case, did not come from reassurance. It came from intimidation paired with attention. In social settings, Wilson was described as intense but magnetic. He spoke openly about violence, conflict, and chaos in his life. Rather than repelling others, this candor often drew them closer. There was a sense of proximity to danger that felt thrilling rather than alarming. That miscalculation proved fatal. In October 2019, Wilson committed 2 murders within hours. Both victims were women he had encountered through social interaction. The violence was personal, direct, unapologetic. There was no elaborate planning, no attempt at concealment rooted in sophistication. Instead, there was escalation. What distinguishes Wilson from the killers before him is not method, but mindset. He did not believe he could disappear forever. He believed he would be noticed. He called people after the killings. He spoke openly. He acted as though consequence was inevitable and irrelevant. This was not avoidance. It was exposure. Wilson lived in an era where criminal identity could be shaped by media coverage, online discussion, and public reaction. He became aware of how quickly his name spread, how narratives formed, how attention intensified. Rather than retreating, he engaged with it. Infamy was not a side effect. It was part of the equation. When Wilson was arrested, his demeanor remained confrontational and performative. He made statements designed to provoke. He leaned into the persona that had begun to define him publicly. Tattoos became symbols. Courtroom. Appearances became spectacle. Even then, fascination persisted. Online communities discussed him. Comment sections filled with reactions ranging from fear to attraction. The conversation itself became part of the story. Violence was no longer just an act. It was content. That shift marked something new. Wade Wilson did not rely on trust built over time. He did not rely on respectability or intelligence. He relied on visibility. He demonstrated how modern charm could function without subtlety, how danger could be signaled openly and still draw people closer, how notoriety could blur moral boundaries until fascination replaced caution. His case forced a difficult realization. In a world where attention is constant, warning signs no longer stop interaction. Sometimes they encourage it. The line between red flag and attraction becomes dangerously thin. Wilson did not hide his volatility. He advertised it. And yet, access was still granted. Conversations continued. Relationships formed. The assumption that danger announces itself and is therefore avoidable collapsed entirely. When Wilson was sentenced, the legal process brought formal closure. But culturally, the impact lingered. His case existed not only in court records, but across digital spaces where interpretation, speculation, and fixation continued long after the verdict. This was charm adapted to a new age. Not the charm of persuasion, not the charm of legitimacy, but the charm of infamy. Wade Wilson demonstrated that the most dangerous shift was not in the nature of violence, but in how it was received. When notoriety itself becomes attractive, traditional warning systems fail. Attention replaces instinct. Exposure replaces caution. And with that, the arc of charm completed another transformation, from ideology to trust, from respectability to intelligence, from invisibility to terror, from legitimacy to spectacle. The killers changed, the mechanisms adapted, but the outcome remained the same. Charm, in all its forms, continued to open doors. And as the modern world moves faster, louder, and more connected than ever, the final question remains unresolved. Not whether charm can be dangerous, but whether we are still capable of recognizing when it becomes lethal. Charm was never the crime. It was the doorway. Across every case, trust was extended before danger was recognized. Certainty felt safer than doubt. And hesitation bought time, violence did not need. These stories endure because they are not only about killers, but about how instinct is overridden and warning signs are ignored in the presence of confidence and familiarity. If you value slow, deeply researched dark documentaries like this, consider subscribing for more long-form stories. And before you go, tell me, where are you watching from?